Declan Morrow showed up at the hospital. He wasn't there for himself. He'd gotten a call at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. His neighbor, Patricia Walsh, had collapsed in her kitchen. Her husband had been gone 3 years. Her kids lived out in Vancouver and Calgary, hadn't visited since Christmas before last. Declan had a spare key because he'd been picking up her mail when her hip was bad, and somewhere along the way that arrangement had become something closer to checking in on her every couple of days. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours, not because anyone asked him to, just because it didn't feel right to leave. That was the kind of man Declan was, not the kind who made speeches about it, the kind who just stayed. He was 41, and he worked maintenance at Ridgemont Regional Medical Center in a mid-sized city tucked between Lake Erie and the escarpment. The kind of Ontario city that had once been industrial and was now trying to figure out what it was becoming. He'd been there 11 years. He knew the HVAC system better than most of the engineers who'd installed it. He knew which elevator stuck on cold mornings, which wing had the leaky steam pipe that came back every February no matter what anyone did, and exactly how long it took to walk from the loading dock to the ICU if you were in a hurry. He also knew, without being told, that people in that building were having the worst days of their lives. He moved quietly. He fixed things without making a production of it. When a family was camped in a hallway waiting for news, he rerouted his work so the noise wouldn't reach them. Nobody told him to do that either. He had 2 kids of his own. Brendan, who was 15 and obsessed with hockey and terrible at hiding how much he still needed his dad, and Cora, who was 12 and reading books 3 grade levels above her class and watching Declan when she thought he wasn't looking, the way kids do when they're trying to understand what a grown person is made of. Their mother, Jessamine, had left 4 years ago. Not cruelly. There hadn't been a blow-up, no dramatic exit. She just slowly turned toward something else. Someone else. A life in Toronto that had nothing in it that looked like Declan or the city they'd lived in or the small house on Dunmore Street with the crooked front step he kept meaning to fix. She sent money when she could. She called on birthdays. It was civil, the way the aftermath of something painful sometimes gets civil once the pain is just something you carry around rather than something actively happening to you. Declan had kept the house, kept the kids, kept showing up. The morning after the hospital waiting room, he was back at Ridgemont by 7 a.m. He had a faulty air handling unit on the 3rd floor to deal with and a work order backlog that never actually got shorter. He changed into his uniform in the locker room and poured coffee from the machine that made it taste like it had been filtered through a paper bag, and he went to work. That was the morning he first noticed Imogen Vargas. She was standing outside the stairwell door on the 3rd floor, holding a tablet against her chest, frowning at the ceiling like it had personally offended her. She was around his age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with dark hair pulled back, and the particular look of someone who was running on not enough sleep and too much accountability. "There's a sound," she said, without looking at him. "It starts around 2 in the morning and stops around 4, like a low vibration. The patients on this floor have been complaining." "That'll be the AO, Declan said. "I've got it on the list." She looked at him then. "How long has it been on the list?" "Since Monday." She held his gaze for a moment. "It's Thursday." "I know." He didn't offer excuses. There weren't good ones. The department was understaffed and the equipment was aging, and nobody on the administrative side seemed to understand that those 2 things together meant something was always falling slightly behind. He'd flagged it 3 times in the past year. The flags had been acknowledged and filed, and nothing had changed. Imogen was a patient experience coordinator. He learned that later. Her job was to sit between the clinical side and the administrative side and translate, which meant she regularly made enemies on both ends. She'd been at Ridgemont 8 months, transferred from a hospital in Mississauga after some kind of restructuring, and she was the kind of person who wrote things down in real notebooks with actual pens and then followed up, which made her unusual. She also had a daughter. Declan found that out 2 weeks later when he was fixing a tap in the family lounge on the 2nd floor, and she came in to use the kettle. The girl was 7, named Petra, and she'd apparently been sick enough the year before that Imogen had made the decision to move closer to her own mother in Ancaster and take whatever job was available nearby. The girl was fine now, had been fine for months, but Imogen had built a new life here and wasn't dismantling it. He didn't ask many questions, he just listened. She noticed that too. They didn't become friends quickly. Imogen wasn't the type to warm fast to anyone, and Declan had a natural reticence that people sometimes mistook for coldness. But they kept running into each other in the way that people do in mid-sized institutions, where the same people circulate through the same hallways. And slowly the frowning at the ceiling version of her gave way to something that occasionally included a joke at the expense of hospital administration, which he appreciated. In October, the hospital announced that it was bringing in an external management consultancy to review operations. The firm was called Hadwick Group. Their representative was a man named Sterling Cole, who arrived in a good suit and spoke fluently about efficiencies and resource optimization in the evolving landscape of patient-centered care. He had the particular talent of making cuts sound like gifts. He walked the floors with a clipboard and a smile and asked questions that felt like interest but were actually audits. Declan had seen consultants before. He fixed things in the background and didn't draw attention and waited for them to leave. This time felt different. In November, a pipe burst in the East Wing. It was an old pipe. Declan had written it up twice, with documentation, with cost projections for replacement versus patch repair, with a note that said plainly that the patch approach was going to fail before spring. The facilities director, a man named Terrence who had been coasting toward retirement for 2 years, had signed off on the cheaper fix both times. When the pipe went, it flooded part of the second floor. Nobody was hurt, but 2 patient rooms were evacuated in the middle of the night, and there was significant water damage to a medication storage area. Sterling Cole was on the floor by 8 a.m. the next morning. By noon, Declan had been called into Terrence's office. By 3 p.m., he was being walked to HR. The reasoning, as presented, was a documentation error, a maintenance log that Terrence had apparently amended to show a different inspection date, and which now, in the aftermath of the flood, had Declan sign off on a record he hadn't actually completed that way. He didn't know about the amendment until he was sitting across from an HR manager who was sliding a paper toward him. He said, clearly and without raising his voice, that the document had been altered. He said he had email records of both reports he'd submitted. He said he knew exactly what had happened and why. They thanked him for his input. They handed him a termination letter. He drove home in the middle of the afternoon, parked in front of the house on Dunmore Street, and sat in the car for a long time. The crooked front step was still crooked. He'd never fixed it. Brendan and Cora didn't need to know everything, but they knew something had happened. He told them that night, at dinner, straight. He'd lost his job. It wasn't fair. They were going to be okay. Cora put her fork down and looked at him the way she always did, like she was measuring the distance between what he said and what was true. "Do you believe that?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "I do." He wasn't sure he did, not entirely, but he believed it enough. The next weeks were a particular kind of hard, the administrative kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't look like crisis from the outside but wears you down like weather. He filed for wrongful dismissal. He found a paralegal who worked on contingency. He spent his evenings going through email archives, pulling together everything he'd submitted and cross-referencing it against what had been recorded in the system. Imogen called him 2 weeks after he was let go. She'd heard through the building. People talk in hospitals the same as anywhere. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't think it was right. Then she paused and said she'd been looking into something and asked if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. He said yes. She'd been doing her own digging. Her job gave her access to patient satisfaction data and complaint records, and she'd noticed something over the past months. A pattern in the timing of maintenance-related complaints, in what got flagged and what got quietly closed. There were also 2 previous employees who'd left under circumstances that didn't quite match their official departures. She'd talked to one of them informally, a woman who'd been in the clinical equipment team before Hadwick arrived. The picture that was forming wasn't just about Declan. It was about how Hadwick Group operated, coming into institutions, identifying employees who documented problems that leadership had ignored, and clearing them out before those documents could become liability. It was careful. It was legal, just barely, and it had apparently worked before. She told him this over coffee in a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday afternoon, with Petra doing drawings on a napkin at the other end of the table, and she watched his face while she talked. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. She looked at her coffee cup. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I think you're someone who'd do the same. He would have. That was the thing. The wrongful dismissal case moved slowly, as these things do. The paralegal was good, but overworked. Declan took on contract work, a property management company that needed someone reliable, and he was that. Nothing if not that. He got up every morning and made Brendan's lunch and drove Cora to her science club and came home tired and went through documents at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed. Imogen filed a formal complaint with the hospital's patient safety board about the Hadwick process. She did it carefully, with everything documented, citing specific incidents and specific records. She expected pushback. She got it. Her contract wasn't renewed when it came up in January. She called Declan when she found out. He showed up with groceries, which she hadn't asked for, and initially resisted, and then accepted because Petra needed to eat and Imogen was too tired to argue. They sat at her kitchen table after Petra went to sleep, and for the first time since this had started, something cracked a little in the way she held herself. Not dramatically, just a long exhale and her hands flat on the table, and the quiet acknowledgement that she was scared about money and tired of being angry. "You did the right thing," Declan said. "The right thing cost me my job," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "What do we do now?" she asked. He thought about it, really thought about it the way he thought through a repair problem. What was the actual issue? What were the systems involved? What was the approach that actually fixed the thing rather than just quieting it temporarily? "We don't go away," he said. She looked at him. "That's the thing they're counting on," he said. "That eventually it gets too hard and people stop. We don't stop." She picked up her pen. She always had a pen, and opened a notebook. "Okay," she said, "then let's be methodical about it." They were methodical. Over the following months, they built a case that was no longer just about Declan's termination. Imogen had connected with a journalist at a regional paper who was interested in Hadwick Group more broadly. There were rumblings from 2 other Ontario hospitals where similar patterns had played out. Declan's paralegal connected with a labor lawyer who had seen Hadwick's name before. The woman from the clinical equipment team agreed to provide a formal statement. In May, a story ran. It wasn't front-page national news. It was regional, careful, attributed properly to documented sources. But it was specific enough and credible enough that the hospital board announced an independent review of the Hadwick engagement. In July, the review found significant irregularities in how several employee departures had been handled, including improper documentation amendments. The report names Terrence specifically. It also noted that recommendations for infrastructure repairs had been systematically deprioritized in ways that contributed to the pipe failure. Declan's case was settled in August. He didn't get everything. These things never work out to everything. But he got enough, and more importantly, the record was corrected. The documentation was set right. He was officially a person who had done his job correctly and been wrongfully removed. And that was in writing now, which mattered more to him than the money. He was offered a position back at Ridgemont. He thought about it for a week. He said no? Not out of bitterness. He genuinely thought about it and decided that the place was still working through what it was going to be, and he'd spent 11 years there and given it what he had, and it was time to find out what else he could do. He went to the facilities director job at a smaller regional hospital in Brantford that had been posted for 3 months and hadn't found the right person. He knew how to run a department that didn't have enough resources. He knew how to document properly and advocate clearly and find the repair that actually fixed the problem. They hired him in September. Imogen, meanwhile, had been offered a contract position with the Provincial Patient Safety Office. The formal complaint she'd filed and the subsequent review had put her name in front of people who valued the kind of careful, documented advocacy she did. It was a lateral move financially, but a significant one in terms of scope. She took it. Petra started 2nd grade that fall. She was the kind of kid who immediately befriended whoever was sitting next to her and came home reporting everything about them as though relaying field dispatches. On the Saturday after Imogen's first week at the new position, Declan brought Brendan and Cora over for dinner. It was nothing ceremonial. Imogen made pasta. Brendan ate an amount that startled her. Cora and Petra discovered a mutual interest in a particular book series and disappeared to Petra's room for an hour, which gave the adults a kind of accidental quiet that neither of them had planned for. They sat at the kitchen table again. The notebooks were not out. There was wine this time. You know what the worst part was? Imogen said at some point. Which part? Declan said. When I first filed the complaint, I kept second-guessing myself, thinking maybe I'd misread it. Maybe I was making something bigger than it was. She turned her glass. I'd lie awake at 2 in the morning thinking, what if I'm wrong? But you weren't. No, but you don't know that when you're lying awake. She looked at him. What kept you going, genuinely? He thought about the real answer, not the easy one. Cora asked me if I believed we'd be okay, he said, that first night, and I said yes. He paused. I think I just didn't want to make a liar out of myself in front of my kid. She laughed, a real one, short and surprised. Downstairs, something crashed in Petra's room, and then both girls started giggling at a volume that suggested no one was hurt, just chaotic. Brennan, who had been watching something on his phone at the other end of the table, looked up and then immediately went back to his phone in the manner of a teenager who has decided that what is happening around him is not his concern. It was an ordinary evening, deliberately, gratefully ordinary. The hospital board at Ridgemont issued a formal apology to both Declan and Imogen in October as part of implementing the independent review's recommendations. It was read aloud at a board meeting neither of them attended. Imogen's mother sent her a text that said, they should have done this a year ago. Declan's paralegal emailed with, for what it's worth, this doesn't happen often. You should both be proud. Sterling Cole, as far as anyone could track, had moved on to another engagement in Alberta. Hadwig Group was still operating. These things are rarely clean endings. But Terrence retired with slightly less grace than he planned. The documentation practices at Ridgemont were restructured under new facilities leadership, and somewhere in the Provincial Patient Safety Office archives, there was now a detailed report, written in Imogen's precise hand, cross-referenced and sourced and formatted with the care she brought to everything, that would make it harder for the same pattern to work the same way again. Declan fixed the step on Dunmore Street in November finally. It took 40 minutes. He'd been putting it off so long he'd built it into something bigger than it was. And then he did it, and it was just a thing that needed doing, that was now done. Cora came out and looked at it and said, what took you so long? He sat back on his heels and looked at the step too. I kept waiting for the right time, he said. She considered this with the particular thoughtfulness of a 12-year-old who is already seeing through most of the things adults say. There isn't really a right time, she said. There's just time. He looked at her. Where did you read that? He said. She shrugged and went back inside. He stayed on the front step for a while longer, in the November cold, with the afternoon light going flat across the street and the neighborhood quiet around him. He thought about the year behind him, the termination letter, the kitchen table documents, the phone calls from Imogen at 9 p.m., because something new had come up, the settlement, the new job, the pasta dinner, the ordinary Saturday evening that had felt like something being repaired. He didn't know exactly what came next. He was learning, slowly, that not knowing exactly wasn't the same as not being okay. He got up and went inside, and the step held. I keep thinking about that front step. Declan had walked past it every single day for years, knew it was crooked, knew exactly what it needed, kept putting it off because something more urgent always seemed to demand his attention first. And then one afternoon, he just did it. 40 minutes. Done. The thing he'd been carrying around as a problem turned out to just be a task. I think that's what this whole story really comes down to, if I'm being honest with myself. There's a version of Declan that quietly accepts the termination letter, tells himself the system is too big, swallows the injustice because fighting back feels impossible when you've got a mortgage and 2 kids and no guarantee of anything. A lot of people do that. I understand why. It's not weakness. It's exhaustion. But Declan didn't do that. Not because he was fearless, but because he understood something that I think takes most of us a long time to learn. That the way you respond to being treated unfairly is one of the few things that actually belongs to you. What struck me most about him wasn't the outcome. It was the consistency. The way he documented those maintenance reports properly, twice, knowing full well that leadership wasn't going to act on them. He did it anyway, because it was the right record to make. That's not strategy, that's character. And when everything came apart, that character was exactly what held him together and ultimately what proved his case. Imogen is the same way. just differently expressed. She's sharper in her anger, more precise in how she moves through bureaucracy. But underneath it, she's operating from the same place. A genuine belief that careful, honest work matters, and that the truth, documented properly, has weight. She could have looked at what happened to Declan and decided that keeping her head down was the smarter play. Instead, she went deeper into the thing that was uncomfortable, because she had the clarity to see what was actually happening and the backbone to say so. What I find myself sitting with is how much of their eventual vindication came down to intelligence, not cleverness in the manipulative sense, but the kind of clear-eyed thinking that asks, what is the actual problem here, and what does solving it actually require? They didn't let their anger make them sloppy. They built something careful and real out of what had been done to them. And then they held on. That's the part that doesn't get said enough. The months between the termination and the settlement weren't dramatic. They were just long, grinding. The kind of persistence that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Just a person at a kitchen table at 11 p.m., going through emails again, one more time, making sure the record is right. Cora, at 12 years old, told her father there isn't a right time, there's just time. I think she's correct. The step gets fixed when you decide to fix it. The fight gets fought when you decide it's worth fighting. What Declan and Imogen both understood, eventually, is that waiting for conditions to be easier is just another way of handing the outcome to someone else. I'm not sure I'd have done what they did. I'd like to think so. But I know that watching it, I feel something shift, a reminder that the things most worth holding on to are usually the things that cost you something to hold.